Hey class and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about where to find sources, what type of sources you want to look for, and how to evaluate your research sources once you have found them. So essentially there's two main types of sources, at least for the purposes of our class. We're talking mainly about primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are going to be things like works of art or literature, as well as research collected by like a scientist or a field observant or something like that. They also include firsthand eyewitness accounts. So if you're writing a literary criticism paper about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, then Pride and Prejudice is going to be your primary source. Secondary sources are going to be things written about primary sources. So your primary source is going to be your, eyewitness account. Your secondary source is going to be the journalistic article that was written about it. Or your primary source is going to be scientific research in the field, and your secondary source is going to be, an essay explaining and analyzing the raw data. If you find a journal article on the role of women in Jane Austen's work, that's going to be a secondary source because it's about a piece of art. Now, I do want to point out that you won't always have both types of sources in your essays. For example, if you're writing on global warming, it's highly possible that all of your sources will be secondary. And you might not have secondary sources sometimes either. If you're writing a film review and using no outside sources, you will only have one primary source, whatever film it is that you are reviewing. Okay, so let's talk about where you find scholarly sources and what you want to look for. So, in general, scholarly sources tend to be in, these kind of broad categories. Peer-reviewed sources, these are going to be like journal articles. Non-fiction books, there are books written on practically every topic that you can think of. Certain websites that end in .edu or education websites, .gov or government websites, .us are also government websites, as well as usually .org. Now, .org are just organizational websites, so there's some that are great and some that you maybe want to stay away from. And then the last category I have up here is expert interviews. If you can find an expert interview or conduct an interview yourself, a lot of times this lends credibility to your writing. Okay, so I said scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and a lot of times when I say things like articles, students think magazine or newspaper articles, and there is a really big difference between journals and magazines. So I just wanted to bring that up really quickly. If you have a journal, usually there's an author with credentials. That means, so for example, in this Journal of Zoo and Wildlife Medicine right here, the person writing those articles are veterinarians. They're people that are qualified in that field, whereas in a regular magazine, you don't usually get that. Usually it's just a staff writer. Maybe the same staff writer is going to write on like 10 steps to have clearer skin, how to lock in your man and, get him to marry you, and the yoga and meditation routine that will help relax your mind, body, and soul, right? That particular author, while maybe they're incredibly talented, they're not a dermatologist, they're probably not a clinical psychologist or a relationship expert, and they're probably, not like some sort of spiritual guru. They're just an author. So that's a big difference in these two. Usually scholarly journals are going to include an abstract. This is a brief summary at the beginning. There's few or no advertisements in journal articles, whereas there's lots of advertisements in magazines. Sometimes there's more advertisements than there is actual content. Journals are usually published in black and white, whereas magazines are published on shiny, happy, colorful paper. Scholarly journals are usually published quarterly, and magazines are usually published weekly or monthly. They have very different goals and target audiences. So journals are meant to educate, whereas magazines are mostly meant to entertain. There are also some sources that are not considered scholarly, and these are things that you don't necessarily want to use. So, personal websites. Um, and there's going to be an exception to this rule, or to all of these rules, really, but for the most part, stay away from personal websites. If you're writing on something like, cancer treatment, you want articles from peer reviewed medical journals, not websites that are like, how I drank 17 glasses of orange juice a day and cured my cancer. Now, if you're looking for anecdotal evidence or people telling their own stories, those might work. Wikipedia, generally, Wikipedia is pretty reliable. The issue is not reliability. The issue is that the day you look at it and the day I look at it, it can have very different information on there because it's constantly being edited. And it can be edited by anybody. You want to stay away from overly biased websites, and you want to stay away from works of fiction or opinion in terms of using them as research. If you're writing about them, that's totally fine, but that would make it a primary source, not a secondary source. But I'll give you an example. Trevor Noah wrote a book called Born a Crime about his experience growing up in South Africa. So if I was writing a research paper on apartheid in South Africa, I might use a quote from his book as anecdotal evidence, but I wouldn't use it as social or statistical evidence because that's not what it is. Even though it's a memoir, it's not designed to be that type of information. You also want to check for bias in your sources. Lots of websites are going to have an obvious bias. The Wall Street Journal is conservative. So when you read that, you're going to know that it kind of has a conservative slant. CNN is liberal. So when you read CNN, you're going to know, okay, CNN is going to lean, further to the left. The Catholic Digest is religious. Obviously, none of those things are inherently bad. You just want to be aware of them. Excuse me. Some sources are going to be not as obvious. So, for example, MartinLutherKing.org is actually a website owned by the neo-Nazi group Stormfront, and says some terrible things about Martin Luther King Jr., but it pops up in searches. And part of the reason that, a neo-Nazi white supremacist group would want to own a website like this is to spread misinformation. DHMO.org is a website dedicated to the research of dihydrogen monoxide and its toxic effects. This is actually a prank that was started in 1983. I think it was an April Fool's Day prank, and you can find all sorts of information on this page about how dihydrogen monoxide is slowly poisoning everybody on the earth over the course of anywhere from 60 to 100 years. Worth of exposure. And of course, dihydrogen monoxide is two hydrogens and one monoxide, or H2O. But what about those things that kind of fall in between scholarly journals and magazine articles that would be read just for fun? Things like newspapers, trade magazines, periodicals, opinion pieces, stuff like that. Can you use those? How do you use those? What do you do with those? So generally, if you're looking for, scientific or statistical or social evidence, you want to go towards the scholarly journals. But there is a time and place for sources like that. And I'll give you an example. I had a student one time who wrote an essay about the 1929 stock market crash. And one of the things that this student did in their work is they looked at newspaper articles that were published at the time that the stock market was crashing. So in October of 1929, what were the people saying about it then versus what do people say about it now? And that was a great use of that type of source. But if I use a newspaper, trade magazine, periodical, or opinion piece, I go into it always with the understanding that there is no guarantee of credibility. When something is peer reviewed, it means if it's written by a doctor, other doctors looked at it and signed off on it and said, yes, this is kind of the general consensus in the doctor world. Newspapers are not like that. Newspapers are designed to sell newspapers, which is why they publish things sometimes that maybe they don't actually know for certain is true, or sometimes they publish things that are questionable. So, for example, you can find newspapers that were published that have headlines that say things like, Obama was born in Kenya. Even though we know verifiably that that is not the truth, you still find those things in published newspapers. Now, they probably published a correction to that, but usually those newspapers do not publish corrections on the first page. They're back in the classifieds, between Jennifer wants to babysit your children and I have a 1973, Chevrolet for sale. So just be aware that they don't have the same guarantee of credibility as other sources do. Okay, so where do you find all of these great sources? The best place, the place I always tell students to start with, is your college library. Your college library has a ton of databases. There's ebooks, there's actual books, there's just so many resources that you have available to you. So go to your college library. You can also get what is called a TextShare card if you live in the state of Texas. So you can get this card from your college library, and it allows you to check out books from other libraries in the state of Texas. It's a nifty little thing to have. And then there are other online databases like Google Scholar. Now, Google Scholar has some great material, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult to track down the full text of the articles that it's recommending to you, which is why I always suggest starting with your college library. Okay, so once you have found sources, you have a responsibility to evaluate these sources. You are an academic, you are a critical thinker, you are going to look at these sources and say, okay, is this source A, reputable? Does it B, work for what I need? And is it a good source of information? And there's just some general things that I want you to look at. The first one is relevancy or timeliness. When was this published? Does it matter when it was published? So if you are writing an essay on genetic engineering, something from 5 years ago is old news, right? It maybe is not relevant anymore. Whereas if you're writing on a topic like Macbeth by Shakespeare, maybe something published 200 years ago is exactly, the piece that you need for your research paper. So it's really going to depend on the topic that you're looking at. If you're looking at technology, science, medicine, a lot of times you want something very, very recent. Whereas if you're looking at something like art or history or literature, it maybe doesn't matter as much how old the source is. Look at the credibility of the source. Does this source usually publish credible information, right? If you find something that seems really credible, but it's published in the National Enquirer alongside an article about how, all of our major politicians are really lizard people, you might question the credibility of the source. Look at the credibility of the author. What are the author's credentials? If you're looking at something in a science journal, it should be published by a scientist. Look at the references or citations. What type of research sources does this article quote? Do they point you in a direction if you want more information? Do they have a research list a reference list or a bibliography, something like that? If there's no other sources mentioned, remember that that's not an argument, that's an opinion, because it has to be based on reasons and data and evidence for it to be an argument. Look for objectivity or bias. Is there any apparent bias or hidden bias? Do they address the counter argument with respect? Those are kind of things that you want to look for. And then currency. Who paid for the study, right? If you find a study saying that, all humans should drink 6 glasses of milk a day, and you look and see that it was paid for by, the dairy industry, it might raise some questions. And you might go, I wonder if the fact that the dairy industry is paying for a milk study is a conflict of interest. Okay. So if you have questions about where to find sources, or if your sources are good or scholarly, if you can use a particular source for a particular essay, please do not hesitate to reach out. There's resources on Blackboard. And then, as always, you can send me an email or a text message via Remind.